Where Brother James McCann will be leading us with a workshop on Daniel chapter 8. We'll start with a prayer. If you just stay sitting where you are, I'll give opening prayer. Our dear Father in heaven, we come before Thee now, thankful for this time we have to come and read of Your word and to consider the messages that You've left in it for us, particularly as tonight we consider the things from Your servant Daniel that he recorded many years ago, the messages You gave him of the things that would come to pass in the future. May we be encouraged as we read of them and see how some of them have been fulfilled and others are still yet to come. May we be encouraged that truly You are in control of this world and where it is headed, and ultimately You'll bring about Your purpose of putting Your name in the earth when Your Son returns, and we long for that day. So then we would leave this evening in Thy care. We ask all these things even through our Lord Jesus the Christ. Amen. So we'll take a reading to introduce the session tonight. We'll take that reading from Daniel chapter 8. So Daniel chapter 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will, and became great. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with a collar against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up 4 notable horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven. And he cast down some of the host, and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself, even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of the transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practised and prospered. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleaned. And it came to pass, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, and had sought for the meaning, then, behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. And so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid, and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, for At the time of the end shall be the vision. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. For at the time appointed the end shall be. The ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, the king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, and he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. And the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told, is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted, and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up, and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. So then, with that as an introduction, I'd invite Brother James McCann to give his presentation on Daniel chapter 8.
Thanks, Brother Roby. Good afternoon, everyone. Just quickly before we start, has everyone got a sheet? Cam, Tyler, have you got the stuff there? You left it out there? Could everyone just grab one, because hopefully this is going to lead us through the chapter. Things for you to jot down, things for you to mark in. We're going to hopefully cover a lot of ground tonight, so I do apologise that it may not be as much time for a lot of interactive workshop ideas, but we are going to still make it interactive. But hopefully you've got a pen to write down on here. If you actually have some colouring in pencils as well for your Bible, you'll really need that as well, because there's a lot of really exciting things in Daniel chapter 8. In fact, things that relate even to our generation today. Now, did you notice that in our reading what Brother Owen was doing there? Did you notice in verse 17 that when Gabriel comes to Daniel to actually tell him about the vision and its interpretation, that he actually says it is for the time of the end. So this vision, although we're going to do a little bit of backtracking into history and looking at the events of this ram and the goat, we're going to find that the events of this chapter take us all the way right down to some exciting things that are happening right now in our generation, to see how relevant the Word of God is for us. Now, if you've got a pencil to colour in, you'll notice that there was a key word that was used in the reading tonight that describes what chapter 8 is. Could someone please tell me, what do you think chapter 8 actually is? And this word is actually mentioned 9 times in the chapter. What's this chapter all about? Uncle Gazy's got the answer. I'll give you a hint. One of the words is mentioned in verse 1, and in verse 2 it's mentioned twice. Same word. Awesome. Excellent. Now, how many times in the chapter did I say it was used? 9. But you'll notice that there's a really interesting pattern. For instance, in verse 1 and both in verse 2, there's 3 occurrences right at the beginning of the chapter. So you can colour them in. And then if you come across to when Gabriel is talking to Daniel, it's mentioned 3 times again. Once in verse 13, the other in 15, and the other in 16. Actually, there's a 4th. It's one in 17 as well. So it's 10 times in the chapter. I miscounted, sorry. So it's mentioned in verse 13, vision. Verse 15, seen the vision. The end of verse 16, understand the vision. And the end of verse 17, shall be the vision. And then it's 3 other occurrences now right to the end of the chapter. There's 2 in verse 26 and 1 in verse 27. So you might say, great, there's 10 times the word vision is mentioned in the chapter. The reason that that's really important, young people particularly, is because when we start to look at the time periods and what's going on in this vision, we need to look at it holistically and see that Daniel is being presented with something very unique. Okay, and there's something that's going to grab us because it's going to take us all the way down now to our own generation today. In fact, things that are happening in the world right now are actually springing out of this chapter. So that's what makes it really exciting. And the other thing that's very faith affirming, particularly for, I'm going to say us as young people, is when we can see that the Word of God is something that is, although so old and yet so relevant today, it brings a great deal of power and strength to us, because when God, gave us this, we can see that only He who knows the beginning from the end could actually tell us all this information. Now, does anyone know what language is the book of Daniel written in? Any ideas? This is going to be a long night if we don't... Sorry? Yeah? It was actually a trick question. Yeah, there's 2 languages that it's written in. And if you're wondering, well, how would you know that? If you read the first line, it actually says the book of Daniel is written in 2 different languages. So the answers are here, but the one language is actually in the Chaldee or the Aramaic, okay? And the other language is Hebrew. So the first little part in Daniel 1, then it jumps across to Daniel 8 through to the end, is actually written in Hebrew. But Daniel chapters 2 to 7 was written in the Chaldee or the Aramaic, okay? So you might say, so what? What's the point of that? Well, does anyone know the reason why that's the case? Why is it written in these 2 different languages? Yep. Awesome. It's always has a reason, and it's being directed particularly in chapters 2 to 7 to the Gentile powers. Okay, so it's looking at the Gentile dominion of the kingdoms of men in chapters 2 to 7. But in chapter 1 and then 8 through to 12, it's specifically in Hebrew because it's written to the Jews. And we're going to see tonight that this vision, and you might see up there on the screen, it's the vision concerning the daily. You might think, what, the Daily Telegraph, or what are we referring to? It's actually the vision of the daily sacrifice, the evening and morning sacrifice. Now, to the Jewish people, they knew what that was, because their day began and their day ended with a lamb being sacrificed. And it was called the continual burnt offering. And the reason why it was continual is because they would put one on in the morning and literally it would burn all day till the night. And then at the night time, they'd put another one on and it'd burn all the way through the night. And then the next morning, they'd put the new one on and it just kept going in cycles and in cycles and cycles. And God was trying to demonstrate to the people through asking them to do that He wanted their all. He wanted complete dedication in every part of their life. There was never a time for them to switch off, if you wanted to put it that way. So this vision is predominantly spoken to the Jewish people because it has to do with them. And what we're going to find is that not only is this the vision that relates to particularly this sacrifice, but you'll also notice, like in verse 9, it talks about this little horn that waxes great towards the pleasant land. And we'll try and describe some of those things as we go through. But have a look in verse 1. Let's just try and break little parts up as we go. And please feel free to throw out your answers, etc. as we go, because we'd really like to make this interactive and then be able to get the answers down. Now, if you can get them here on this piece of paper, scribble them down as we go. I'll try and have a lot of the stuff up here as well. But what I'd like you to then do, for homework, is actually put this into your Bible, into your margin, so that once you've got it in here and you read it again and again and again, it'll always be those notes that you can go, oh yeah, I know what that means. And it makes the reading come alive when you go through it again. Okay, so our first little question is, it says in verse 1 that this was a vision that appeared to Daniel, but it says at the first, okay, and then it talks about Daniel actually receiving this vision here in the reign of King Belteshazzar, but he says it actually appeared to him after the first, or after another particular vision. So what do you think that's telling us if Daniel's saying after the first? What do you think this is telling us about chapter 8? Any ideas? Excellent. It's the second part. Awesome. So if you're reading that, what should you ask yourself? When's the first part? Now, do you guys remember last year we did a little bit of a workshop? What was the chapter we did the workshop on? It's too long ago. The other one? Good answer. Yeah, chapter 9 is going to build on from this, so they are interrelated, but it's actually chapter 7. Okay, so it's after the first. So chapter 7 is very important to chapter 8 because the animals that we have here and the beasts that we have here are a continuation of the beasts that we saw in chapter 7. Okay, so you might remember that there were how many beasts in chapter 7? There were 4 beasts in chapter 7. And what did those 4 beasts correspond to in an earlier chapter in Daniel? Remember, I'm deaf, so you have to yell it out.
Daniel's image.
Awesome. So the metals of Daniel's image. So in Daniel chapter 2, we have metals, and that's the way man saw the kingdoms of men, bright, polished, stand up. Whereas God saw the beasts or in a sense, the kingdoms of men as really just beasts who tore apart his people and his saints. So these animals here, now in a sense of those 4 that were selected in chapter 7, we're actually going to find that Daniel's going to zoom in this vision here, particularly on the goat and the ram. Now, if you notice, our next question says, what is the vision called? Both the beginning and the end, these are like bookends to the chapter. It actually tells us that this is a vision, so we know that it's a vision. But if you look at verse 26, what is the vision actually called? The vision of the what? The vision of the evening and morning. Okay? So this vision is, now you might say, well, what's goats and rams and all that got to do with it? Because it has to do with what these beasts did to God's people and to the system of Jewish religion. Okay? So the evening morning has to do with the sacrifice, the evening morning sacrifice. And this is a vision concerning that daily evening morning sacrifices. Okay? So that's why it's particularly relevant and set in the context of Israel. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of time. I'm going to say, let's go 4 minutes. What I'd like you to do is have a little read through the first few verses of chapter 8, and I want you to come up with some of the features of the ram and some of the features of the goat, and you can put them there on your sheet of paper in the bullet points. And if you've got a bit of extra time in that 4 minutes, look back to chapter 7 and see if there's any data there that you'd like to connect together. But what I want you to try and do is come up with what do you think they mean, what do they represent? And just a little bit of a hint, do you remember last time when we did that big sheet, we looked at all the chapters, and on that big sheet we said Daniel always gives us a vision and then he gives us the interpretation. Now you'll notice that in this chapter. Did you notice the first half of the chapter is the vision? And then in the second part of the chapter, Gabriel gives, this is the interpretation. So if you want to know the meaning to it, you're going to have to piece the beginning and end together. So I'm going to give you 4 minutes, come up with the features of the ram and the goat, and what do you think they represent? Got 4 minutes. If you want to ask me a question, I'll come around and see how you're going. So I'll give you a hint. The ram's got horns. What do you know about the horns? How many of them are there?
2.
Write it down. Okay, sorry, might have to keep going. So here's our goat. Painted that myself. No, just took it off the internet. So, features of the goat. Or ram, sorry, ram. I wonder why everyone was looking at me. So, yeah, okay. That is a ram. I'm not very good at biology. Okay, this is the ram. What do we know about the ram? Features. 2 horns. 2 big horns, very exceedingly, and one was bigger than the other. Yep.
It was unstoppable. No other animal could stop it.
Absolutely. Totally decimated anything that came in its path. It did according to its will, which we might recall is, if we link back to chapter 2 and chapter 7, it's the hallmark of the kingdoms of men. They do what they like. It's got nothing to do with the way they treat God. It has to do with everything the way they want it done. Their will, not God's will. Okay, so what's your interpretation of that, and how do we know? Could I just make this up? Could I just, I could make up any opinion I like of the ram? Can I do that? No. What does the Bible tell me what it is?
It goes on to say that it represents the needs of God.
Yep, great. So we're told in the interpretation. Yep. Does this link to anything we've seen previously in Daniel? Great. So if we look back at Nebuchadnezzar's image, where does the Medo-Persians fit in?
Silver.
Great. The silver are the arms. Cool. Now, what do you notice is absent in chapter 8? What's not here? Babylon's not here. So this vision has transported Daniel forward in time, okay, to the time that he would then later be in the Medo-Persian Empire. And we're getting an insight now of God's vision here concerning this system. Okay, what else do we know about the ram? He was standing, yep. Do you know that from this chapter? Yes, you do. So where does that link to? That's said before, somewhere in Daniel. So that's information we've read before. Where's that?
Isn't it with the beast where the bear is limping?
Right, it's back in chapter 7. Now, we're not told that in chapter 2. We're only told that there were 2 arms. But we're told in chapter 7 and chapter 8 that there was something that came up after the other. So if this is the Medo-Persian, you would suggest that the 2 horns here are of Media and Persia. Why does it say that one was bigger, and why does it say one came up later? Can anyone tell me that? Any ideas? Yep. Exactly right. Do you know which one was more powerful? Exactly right. So the Medes came up first, okay? And you had Darius the Mede initially in Daniel, but it was Cyrus the Persian that particularly took the empire to its greatest degree. So the Persians came up later, and of course they were far more stronger. Now, there's another piece of information that we haven't yet seen. We haven't mentioned. It's in verse 4. What's that information? Absolutely. So that tells us where he was from, because the direction that he's pushing, okay, so he's down here in where Persia is, and so he pushes to the north, to the west, and to the south. So that shows you the direction of his influence and how he became, in a sense, the world empire of that time. So we know a little bit about the ram, okay, and what it represents now. Let's go to the goat, because we now have this goat come onto the scene. So what are the features of our goat? Right, one notable horn particularly. Are we told anything about that notable horn? It was between his eyes, yes. Okay, so something happens to that one notable horn that then 4 come up in its place. So it's broken, so we know something about this notable horn. What else? Right, so I'm sorry I haven't got the slide here where this goes from, but if you have a look again from the degree of where the Persian Empire would be, okay, actually I'll just go back to this one. If you come from the west, you must have come from over here in this region up here. Okay, so from that perspective. Now, what do we think that notable horn is? Are we told what that notable horn is in the chapter? What verse is that, Annie Buck?
21.
So we're told definitively that this, and by the way, do we know first of all, what the goat represents? Tells us that they're Greeks, right? So we now know that this ram is the Greek Empire. Now this beautifully meshes with chapter 2 and chapter 7, for we know that the Medo-Persian Empire was followed by the Greeks, which was the brass. And then we also saw that was the leopard of chapter 7, but now it's described here as a goat. It has a notable horn, and that notable horn is the first king. So if we were to try and piece all of that together, we now know that their first and mighty king, this notable horn, this person that is obvious in this vision here, is Alexander the Great. He's this notable horn. Now what's really fascinating is that when you actually have a look at the idea of this he-goat, that the Bible has taken this image before this even took place and is telling us that this was an apt symbol of the Greeks. Now again, there's a lot to read there, but just something that we all know in a sense from geography, and that is that at that sort of sea surrounding the Grecian peninsula is the Aegean Sea in the Mediterranean. And that Aegean comes from the idea of a goat. Okay, it means the Greek word goat. And Alexander the Great even named his son the son of a goat, which today would not be really considered that flash hot, but really back then that was considered to be very fabulous. So Alexander even named his own son, who funnily enough was not going to go on and reign after him, named his son Alexander Aegis, which in a sense is the son of a goat. So what we've got here is history being played out in absolute clarity, that God, through his angels, has delivered to Daniel this vision to show what was about to take place. And I don't know about you, particularly young people, but I find this amazingly faith-affirming when I see how clear the Bible is. The Bible is just something that is so brilliant, and therefore we can see that only God could have written it. Now, we know something about this goat. There's a feature about him. We've already talked about his notable horn. What else do we know about this goat? A key feature of him. He wasn't touching the ground. What does that tell us about him? Spot on. How can you not touch the ground? Is he floating? He's got wings? Now, I don't know what you think of, but I think of all those Looney Tunes and all that when I was young, of those sort of guys when they used to do things really fast and run, their legs would be spinning in circles like that and they'd be off the ground and shooting across the top. And in a sense, that's the idea here. This goat is moving so quick that he's not even touching the ground. He's moving really quickly through the entire world. Now, if we have a look at, say, the Babylonians or the Medo-Persians or even the Romans, they took decades, some of them even much longer, even hundreds of years, to establish the supremacy across the world. Does anyone know how long it took Alexander the Great and the Greeks?
10 years.
He did it in approximately 10 years. So that's absolutely amazing. Now, if you think about how quick he went, there are three, I suppose, notable victories that he had over Persia. And these are the three that are mentioned here. And we're going to come back to particularly the one of Issus. But Granicus was the first, Issus was the second, and Arbela was the third major victory that Alexander had over the Persian army. So he moved extremely quickly. He took over the entire region of the Persians within approximately 10 years of having that power. So in terms of all the other powers, he stood out because of the speed by which he conquered. But there's another feature again. Have a look at verse 7. Particularly, this is of great note to us because, again, history plays out something very significant here. What was another feature in verse 7 of this goat? He's angry. He's really angry. And you'll notice that it's actually mentioned twice. In verse 6 it says, he came to the ram. So this, in a sense, picture of arrogance and confidence. And he comes and he stands. And it actually says he was standing before the river. And he ran at him in the fury of his power. And it says it again in verse 7. He came and he was moved with anger against him. So what was the cause of this anger that the Greeks had towards the Persians? Does anyone know why particularly this is noted as being something of a feature of this goat? Well, let's do a little bit of a quick history lesson. If we go back in time, we'd actually see that the Greeks were actually made up of a whole array of states. And the problem is with the Greeks is that they were extremely powerful. The problem is they couldn't all agree. And because they could never agree, they could never unite themselves together. So you had the Spartans, you had the Athenians, you had the Macedonians, you had all of these bunches of, in a sense, tribal groups that were all noted warriors, but because they could never come together in unity, they were a force, in a sense, untapped. But it was actually the adversity of the Persians that actually united them in the end. Because when we go back in time to when the Persians were conquering the world, the Persians were extremely cruel people. And when they came across from what is now Turkey across into Greece, they did some absolutely devastating things as they went across, and the Greeks never forgot it. And one of the things particularly that they did is they went to Athens and they burnt and they looted Athens and they burnt it to the ground. And the Greeks never forgot the way that they were treated by the Persians. And the Persians, although a far bigger and more formidable force than the Greeks ever were, the Greeks, though, were united under Alexander. Alexander actually was a person who was able to get them behind him and march forward. And we're going to find when he actually dies, that's why his entire kingdom was then divided again, because they couldn't find someone, I suppose, with the confidence, with the charisma, with the strength to hold, in a sense, that coalition together. So the Persians actually, in destroying Athens and the Greeks initially, many years before, did themselves a great disservice, because now this was the anger that they were brought up with, that they were now going to come against the Persians with all their fierceness and all their anger. And it says that he brake the two horns. And if we only look back in history, and we can see that Alexander was greatly outnumbered in all of the battles that he faced against Darius, and yet he absolutely wiped Darius from the battlefield multiple times. In fact, he routed it to such an extent that Alexander was able to push through from Macedonia. In fact, he just kept going and going and going until even his own army was so tired of the fact that they were just moving and conquering as quickly as they did. But the Greeks got their revenge in the end. And they certainly went and made sure that the Persian power was broken. And it says that they did not in any way stand against him. But of course, he got to the very end and he crushed them to pieces. Now, as Alexander comes back through all his conquering, he comes back to Babylon, to where he was going to position himself for quite some time. But what does Daniel 8 tell us about the notable horn? What happens to this notable horn? In verse 8. Yep, it broke. What do you think that's telling us? Absolutely. Does anyone know how old Alexander the Great was when he died? 32. Or was it 33? I thought it was 32?
I don't know.
Okay, I thought it was 33, but it could be 32, 33. Could have had his birthday wrong, or not sure. So I think it's around about 32 or 33, but he was extremely young when he died. And it was, in a sense, totally out of the flow of all that the Greeks had. Now, what happens after this event of this little horn being broken? What's the next thing that happens in verse 8? Anyone? So 4 horns pop up. So guys, just keep reading through, because the chapter is going to tell us. And as we look through history, we're going to find that this is exactly what happens. Now, there are some people and some critics that actually suggest that this didn't happen, that there was not 4 empires that came up in its place. So I'd like to just spend a little bit of time showing that this isn't wrong, that it actually is true, and clearly that's the case. But it didn't just happen that Alexander died and then the next night 4 people went, yep, I'll take this, I'll take that, and I'll take that. Remember we said that the Greeks were very divided. And although Alexander was very strong, he did have some very powerful generals under his control. And although he was able to keep them at bay, once he passed away, ultimately all of these guys wanted to be the successors of the empire, and none of them could agree. And in fact, over the next 20 years, within the power that the Greeks had taken in 10 years, they fought with themselves again to the point in time, and these are called Diadochi Wars, but virtually they're wars of the successors. And in the first instance, it looked a little bit like this. After the first, say, 10 years of wars, the generals had sort of amalgamated it down to this array of regions where the most powerful could take their influence and rule over it. But the problem was, as each war then slowly knocked off few more, it got down to about 5. And some people believe that this was the 5 horns that came up in its place. But the final war of the successors actually saw the death of Antigonus. And his area of influence there, particularly in the Middle East, which is what we're looking at here, actually passed on to Seleucus, who actually then established himself as being one of the greatest, empires there in the region. And if we keep reading in Daniel, we're going to find that although these 4 did actually take place, so you can actually see Cassander up to the top left. You've got Lysimachus, which is in that region now, what we would call Turkey and Thrace. Then you've got the Seleucid Empire there. Then you've got the Ptolemaic Empire down to the south. So there were 4 actual areas in the end that did come out, 4 major regions. And again, we're not sort of talking here about countries. We're talking about areas of influence, notable powers or horns. So there were 4 empires that ultimately took place. And the reason why that's important is because Daniel goes on to show that from those 4, there were going to be, in the end, only 2 that were predominant. And this is where in Daniel chapter 11, it talks about a king of the north and the king of the south. And although that's not our work tonight, just to sort of show you that the 4 main divisions of the empire were in the end swallowed up into 2. And when Daniel 11 takes over this idea of the king of the north and the king of the south, that's where those 4 coming down to 2 are actually talking about. So the Seleucid Empire to the north becomes the king of the north, and you've got the Ptolemaic Empire, which is to the south. Now, what's fascinating is you might also sort of tie in people like Julius Caesar and people like that. Julius Caesar, of course, was coming from Rome there in the west, but down here in Egypt, there was a general of Rome called Pompey. And Pompey actually established himself to the south, and he began to push up into the land of what we now call Israel, and he actually took over that region for Rome. And that's where Rome actually, about 20 years after that, established Herod, or the Herod tetrarchs, etc., in that region, so that they would actually be, in a sense, Rome's representative reigners or kings in the region of Israel. And that's why when you come to the birth of Christ, we know that Herod, of course, is the key feature in trying to destroy Christ early on. So just to summarize, what we've got is these 4 horns coming up. They were the 4 main generals, or the 4 main regions that took place at the end of all those wars of succession. But now we're introduced to another very important little feature of that, and that is in verse 9. Now, notice it says, out of one of them came forth a little horn. Now, have we seen a little horn before in Daniel? Yes, we have. Where? Yep. Awesome. So remember, we spoke at the start about how Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 were connected. Okay, so we have come across a little horn in chapter 7. Now, just quickly come back to chapter 7. You'll see that there's a little horn in chapter 7, verse 8. Okay, and you'll notice that the features of that little horn are mentioned in verse 11. And also towards the end of the chapter, you'll notice, for instance, in verse 19 and 20, and you'll go right down and follow that down to about verse 25. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is spend about another 4 minutes trying to see if you can look at the features of the little horn of chapter 7 and this little horn here in chapter 8 and see whether you think they're connected or whether you think there's some features that are the same or some that are different. And we're going to try and work out why they're the same or why they're different. So, everyone okay with that? So about another 4 or 5 minutes, we're looking at the little horn of chapter 7, the little horn of chapter 8, trying to compare them, contrast them, etc. See if we can find any connections or anything that's different about them. So it's like the same format where you've got the vision and then interpretation. So the little horn first of all comes up in verse verse 8. Sorry. So verse 8, and you'll see that it's spoken about in verse 11. And then if you jump across like to the fourth beast in verse 19, the interpretation starts, and the little horn is again mentioned in verse 24 and 25. So in verse 24, it says, another shall arise after them, e.g., another horn shall arise after those 10. He shall be diverse, so the he is back like in verse 11. I beheld then because of the voice, the great words that the horn spake. So this horn has a voice. And notice again it says in verse 25, and he shall speak great things against the Most High, shall wear out the saints. So you've got exactly the same features as in verse 8. I considered the horns, and there came up amongst them a little horn. The 3 were plucked up, and this horn had eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth. So the 2 parts of the chapter connect together. Who's the little horn of chapter 7? Okay, sorry, we're going to need to keep going. Quick question. Has anyone found any connections between the horns? Yep. Excellent. Both extremely influential. Yep. Absolutely. Both are part of the kingdoms of men. Yep. Anything else? Here's just a summary I've put together. So again, I probably don't have time to get this down. I'm happy to send this to you if you like. For instance, both of these visions causes grief to Daniel. In verse 19 of chapter 7, it's exceedingly dreadful. In chapter 8, it's exceedingly great. It stamps the residue with his feet, stamps upon them, so it has the same idea of stamping. In chapter 7, you'll notice that it's primarily a religious little horn, because ultimately what this does is he speaks against the Most High, and he speaks against the saints, and he begins to think he has the power to change laws and seasons, etc. And here, this little mouth, as we saw in chapter 7, is the mouth of the 4th beast, the Roman beast. So we showed how even Revelation picks up that the 4th beast, this Roman beast, becomes a religious power that has influence over the whole world. And we saw that in the Roman Catholic Church. We saw that in the papacy. And this little mouth that speaks great things is then picked up in Revelation as being the mouth that also comes out of the mouth of the false prophet. So Revelation again allows us to see how Daniel is beautifully identifying this system. But you'll notice that chapter 8, primarily the chapter 8 little horn, has a military influence. And yet it has a religious association in the same way that chapter 7, although primarily religious, has a military association. So they're interrelated, but they're actually focusing on 2 different aspects of this system here. And we're going to have a look at what that is. Both are hostile to the truth, and both are finally destroyed by Christ, which means both of them are part of the final system. Now, this is really key. Chapter 2, it's the iron that continues to the end when the stone destroys it. So the iron continues all the way to the return of Christ. Chapter 7 backs that up. It's the 4th beast, the iron beast, that Christ destroys. And here in chapter 8, we're talking about a beast or a system that continues until Christ returns. Now, this tells us something really, really significant. In chapter 8, we've been thinking that the focus is on the Persians and then the Greeks. But this little horn is actually now telling us that chapter 8 is also focusing us in on the Roman power that came after it. Now, again, this is just some interesting things to consider to sort of show that case. First of all, we've tied them together in Daniel 7 and 8, but we've seen, though, that their characteristics, although very much the same, there's a different focus on this particular aspect of the empire. But if you notice in chapter 8, there's something that's really significant here. Did you notice that this little horn actually comes out of one of those 4 horns that came from the Greeks? So this Roman power, this Roman influence actually springs out of the Greeks. Now, we already know from Daniel that that's the case. Because if we go back, for instance, to chapter 4, we might remember that the tree, the Babylonian tree that was cut down, is actually surrounded by a band of brass and iron. And that's why historians actually often call it the Greco-Roman Empire. Because although the Greeks were taken over by the Romans, it really is considered, even in biblical language, a continuation of the Greek power. And this actually in history shows some really interesting connections. First of all, you'll notice that Attalus I of Pergamon actually became allied to Rome as Rome was a growing power. And so connected were these empires at the time that Attalus III actually bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. So it is actually true historically that the power of Rome grew out of the influence and the power of the Greeks. So the Bible beautifully picks up that point. That little level of detail, young people particularly, is why the Bible is so fabulous. History accords to the clarity of that so beautifully. So this little horn of the goat is true to say, although Roman, it actually grew out of the influence and power of the Greeks. Now we know that it's Roman because it now gives us a lot more detail in verses 9, 10 and 11. Let's have a look at this detail because we can see very clearly that first of all it tells us that this little horn becomes exceedingly great, and notice it says towards the south, toward the east and toward the pleasant land. So if we go back to our map here, we can actually see that if Rome was that power, we can actually see that it would pick up the geography of that verse perfectly, and particularly towards the pleasant land. But it tells us that it waxed great even to the host of heaven. Now, these little horns then, and these are just verses that prove that the pleasant land is the land of Israel, which is why Daniel always focuses us on those systems, because it has to do with its influence over Israel. But these little horns, and this is just from Brother Thomas, he says, we see that Daniel treats the two little horns, the one, the holy Roman power of the west that came up after the 10 horns, which links us to Revelation, and the other, the pagan Roman power of the east that appeared in Syria and Palestine in the latter end of the Macedonian kingdoms and before the 10 horns by many centuries. So again, just linking these two together, this is now a summary of chapter 7. So both of them are Roman in their power and in their influence, but one is of the west, of the Rome. It's the persecutor of the saints. But here, this little horn of the goat is the persecutor particularly of the Jews, or the Roman power to the east. And that's why Daniel is looking at both of them because of their influence on particularly Israel, as we come to see here. Now, I've run out of time, but we might leave it. We can come back to this at another time. But just to prove to you that this is the work of Rome, you can see that this little horn of the east actually does some key things. It begins its, I suppose, influence over this region by crucifying the prince of the host, or the prince of princes. Now, if you have a look at verse 11, he's called the prince of the host. And if you have a look at verse 25, he's called the prince of princes. Who do you think the prince of the host and the prince of princes would be? Any idea? Jesus. So we know that it was the Roman power that took away the sanctuary, that crucified Jesus, the prince of the princes, and we know that it was this system that finally Jesus will come back to destroy in the end. But I want to finish with just one little connection to the New Testament, because I think this is absolutely magnificent. Can you just hold your hand in Daniel and just come to John chapter 19 for a moment? Let's transport ourselves in time to the words of Jesus. And we'll finish here because this really shows you how Christ himself understood Daniel 8, and he quotes Daniel 8. And you might think of all the things to be remembering when you're being about to be crucified. Why would he do that? Just come to John chapter 19, and let's come to verse 10 for a moment. In John 19, verse 10, here is Jesus standing in the judgment hall against the people who are accusing him of absolutely everything. And Pilate says to him in verse 10, aren't you going to answer me? don't you know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you? Now, what's Pilate saying that he has over Jesus? He says, I've got the power over you. Now, look what Jesus says. The first time Jesus speaks to him, this is what he says in verse 11. Jesus answered and said, you could have no power at all, except it were given you from above. Now, hold your hand there and just go back to Daniel 8 for a moment. Look what it says in Daniel 8. Right, so you can see in Daniel 8 here, towards the end, notice that this chapter is all about the fact that God was going to give power to this beast. Now have a look in verse 24. This kingdom is going to stand up, a kingdom of understanding of fierce countenance, understanding dark sentences shall stand up, verse 23. But in verse 24 it says, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. So Daniel 8 says he's going to be a mighty power in the earth, but the power that he wields is the power that has been given to him, because God is going to let him do that. Jesus plucks that quote out of Daniel 8 and says, you don't have any power at all except God has given you that power. That is absolutely magnificent that Jesus was able to quote from that passage in Daniel 8 to bring it to bear right there in that conversation. And the last thing he says, therefore, he that delivered me unto you has the greater sin. And he was talking about the children of Israel, because back in chapter 8, it says that he would magnify himself against the prince of the host. By him the daily sacrifice would be taken away. And it says that as it was taken away by reason of transgression. In other words, the Jewish people would transgress greatly in handing Jesus up to be crucified by the Roman power. So there's lots of ways to show the power of this chapter and how it's relevant. I'm sorry we didn't have time to keep going, but if at another time we can keep going with chapter 8, we'll try and do that. But I hope that's been helpful, that we've covered somewhat. Thanks.
Thanks, James, for the very interesting class tonight. Hopefully everyone learned something or was reminded of something they looked at in the past. Just a few announcements. Wednesday night, Brother Gary Steele continues his Bible class series on letters to the seven ecclesias. So it's 8 p.m. here Wednesday night. And next Sunday night here at 6 p.m. Is a praise evening. That's all the announcements I've got. So we'll close with a song. I think it's Daniel's song, after which I'll close in prayer.
Praise to God forever, wisdom and power. Life everlasting, the wise with brightness shine. God's spirit power turning many to Yahweh's righteousness. His kingdom is eternal, His dominion it endures from generation to generation. His kingdom is eternal, His dominion it endures from generation to generation. We thank and praise You, our God. You give knowledge to those who search Your heart. You know where light and darkness lie. Give wisdom to the wise. Thank and praise You, our God. You give knowledge to those who search Your heart. If we serve You continually, Your promise will be free.
Just close in prayer. Our dear Father in heaven, we're thankful again for this time that we've had as we've read of Your word, considered the vivid vision that You gave to Your servant Daniel, and as You explained to him the meaning. As we look back and see how those things played out, truly we long for that day of those visions that You gave to Daniel, where ultimately the stone would return to the earth, would come to the earth and knock over the kingdoms of men in that image, and grow to fill the whole world and spread Your glory across this world. And truly we long for that day. So then, as we would leave this place, we leave our lives in Your care, knowing that You provide for us in each and every way. And so then we ask this even through our Lord Jesus the Christ. Amen.